The rain wouldn't stop that day. It pounded the earth like it was trying to drown out my grief, soaking through my black coat as I stood by Emily's grave. My daughter, my only child, was gone at 32, taken by a car crash that made no sense to me. I was 58, a retired elementary school teacher who'd spent her life raising kids, and now I was burying mine. The wooden casket gleamed wet under the gray sky as it sank into the ground, and I couldn't feel my legs. I just stared, hollowed out, wondering how I'd keep breathing without her. David stood next to me, my husband of 30 years, a broad-shouldered man with salt and pepper hair and the confidence of someone who'd built a small construction empire from nothing. I barely noticed him at first, lost in my own head, until his hand clamped around my arm, not gently, like you'd expect from a husband at his kid's funeral, but firm, almost impatient. "Laura, we need to talk," he said, his voice cutting through the sound of the rain. I turned to him, blinking, thinking maybe he wanted to say something about Emily, something to hold on to. Instead, he pulled an envelope from inside his jacket, the kind that looks official and wrong for a place like this. "What's that?" I asked, my throat raw from crying all week. He didn't even look at me, just handed it over like it was nothing. I opened it with shaking hands, rain smudging the ink, and there they were, divorce papers. My name typed out neat and cold, Laura Hensley. I couldn't process it. "David, what is this?" I whispered, searching his face for the man I'd married, the one who'd laughed with me over late-night coffee and held my hand when Emily took her first steps. He finally met my eyes, and there was nothing warm there, just a hard, flat stare. "Emily's gone now," he said, like he was stating a fact about the weather. "There's nothing tying me to you anymore. I'm done, Laura. 30 years is enough." His words hit me like a slap, sharper than the wind whipping around us. I stood there, clutching those papers as people started to drift away from the gravesite, their black umbrellas fading into the mist. My sister-in-law Karen hovered nearby, throwing worried glances our way, but David didn't care who saw. He steered me toward the car, away from her, like he couldn't wait to get this over with. "David, we just buried our daughter," I said, my voice cracking. "How can you do this now?" He unlocked the car door and looked at me like I was a stranger slowing him down. "That's exactly why it's the right time," he replied, calm as anything. "Emily's company, her design business. It's mine now. She left it to me in her will, and the house too. I'm selling it. You'll need to figure out where you're going." I slid into the passenger seat, numb, as he kept talking. "I'm heading to the Bahamas for a couple weeks. A break, you know. When I get back, I expect you gone. 2 weeks, Laura." "That's generous." The car started and he pulled away from the cemetery without a single glance back at Emily's grave. I stared at him, this man I'd shared a life with, built a home with, raised a daughter with, and I didn't recognize him. His jaw was set, his hands steady on the wheel, like he'd already checked out of our marriage years ago. "A break?" I repeated, barely audible over the rain hitting the windshield. "Our daughter just died, David." He shrugged, eyes on the road. "Life moves on, Laura. Mine will anyway. Without you." I wanted to scream, to demand answers, but my voice wouldn't come. Why now? Why today, of all days? He didn't even flinch when I asked. "I've been waiting long enough," he said, his knuckles tightening on the steering wheel. 30 years is a hell of a long time to play a role I didn't want. My mind spun, trying to piece it together. Had he been unhappy all this time? Through the birthday parties, the family dinners, the late nights helping Emily with her homework, he'd missed it, whatever it was, and now here we were, driving away from our daughter's funeral while he dismantled our life like it was nothing. When we got to Emily's house, the place we'd moved into 3 years ago after her divorce to help her get back on her feet, he dropped me off without a word, just grabbed a suitcase from the trunk and headed inside to pack. I stood in the driveway, rain soaking my hair, watching him disappear into the house my daughter had loved, the house he was about to take from me. At 58, I'd lost my child and now my husband. All in a week. I didn't know where I'd go or how I'd start over. All I knew was that David was walking away like I'd never mattered. And something inside me, something small but growing, was starting to burn. The house felt like a tomb that night. Emily's house. Our house now, I guess. Stood quiet and dark, the kind of silence that presses down on you until you can't breathe. I sat at the kitchen table, the divorce papers spread out in front of me like some cruel joke. David's signature stared back at me, bold and final, like he'd been itching to sign it for years. The rain had stopped, but the damp chill clung to everything, seeping into my bones. I was 58, a widow in spirit if not on paper, and I couldn't shake the image of David at the cemetery. His cold eyes, his smug little shrug. How had I missed this side of him for 30 years? I poured myself a glass of water, hands trembling, and tried to make sense of it. He'd said Emily's company was his now, her interior design business, the one she'd poured her heart into after her divorce. She'd built it from late nights sketching at this very table, turning it into something successful, something hers. And the house, too? We'd moved in with her 3 years ago when her ex walked out, thinking we'd be her safety net. Now David was ripping it all away, leaving me with nothing. Where was I supposed to go? A retirement home? A cheap apartment somewhere? I didn't even have a job anymore. Teaching had been my life, but I'd retired 2 years back to spend more time with Emily. My thoughts kept circling back to that last phone call with her. It was 4 days before the crash, and her voice had sounded off, tight, almost shaky. "Mom, I need to see you," she'd said. "It's about Dad and the company. Something's not right." I'd pressed her for more, but she brushed it off, promising we'd talk in person. "Next week," she'd said. "I'll come by for lunch." That lunch never happened. The next day, her car went off a curve on Highway 12 and she was gone. The police called it an accident, faulty brakes, slick roads. I'd believe them because what else could I do? But now, with David's voice echoing in my head, nothing tying me to you anymore. I wasn't so sure. He was upstairs packing, probably tossing shirts into his suitcase for that damn Bahamas trip. I couldn't face him, not yet, so I stayed put, staring at the papers until the words blurred. Around midnight, I heard his footsteps creak down the hall to the guest room. The door clicked shut, and I let out a breath I didn't know I'd been holding. Sleep wasn't coming, not with my daughter in the ground and my husband turning into a stranger. So I got up and wandered the house, looking for something, anything, to anchor me. Emily's office was down the hall, a small room she'd turned into her creative space. I hadn't been in there since the crash. Couldn't bear it, but now my feet carried me there like they had a mind of their own. The door was ajar, and the faint smell of her lavender candle hit me as I stepped inside. Her desk was a mess of sketches and fabric swatches, just like she'd left it. I ran my fingers over a half-finished drawing of a living room, her neat handwriting in the margins, and the ache in my chest sharpened. How could she be gone? I don't know what made me open the bottom drawer. Instinct, maybe, or just dumb luck. But there it was, a little wooden box, no bigger than a book, tucked under a stack of old invoices. It wasn't locked, just latched shut, and my hands shook as I lifted the lid. Inside was a USB drive, plain black, and a folded piece of paper. My breath caught when I saw her handwriting on it. "Mom, I'm sorry I kept this from you." My heart started pounding, loud enough I swore David could hear it upstairs. I unfolded the note, and her words spilled out in a rush. "Mom, if you're reading this, something's happened." Or I finally told you. "I've been digging into the company finances, and Dad's been moving money. Big amounts for years. I don't know what he's planning, but it's bad. The USB has everything I found. I love you. Please be careful." I read it twice, then a third time, my stomach twisting into knots. Moving money? For years? I grabbed my laptop from the kitchen, hands clumsy as I plugged in the USB. Files popped up. Bank statements, emails, property records. I'm no accountant, but even I could see it. Transfers from Emily's business account to some bank in Switzerland. Hundreds of thousands of dollars over the last 2 years. There were receipts, too. A down payment on a beach house in the Bahamas, under David's name only. My head spun. He'd been stealing from our daughter, from the life we'd built together, and hiding it all this time. Then I saw the audio file. My finger hovered over it for a full minute before I clicked play. Emily's voice filled the room, sharp and nervous. "Dad, these numbers don't add up. Where's this money going?" David's voice came next, smooth and clipped. "You're looking at it wrong, Em. This is my future. Our future. I've earned it after all these years." She pushed back. "What about Mom? This is her life, too." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound that made my skin crawl. "Your mother's fine with whatever I decide. Always has been." The recording cut off, and I sat there, frozen. That was 3 months ago, according to the date stamp. Emily had confronted him, and he'd brushed her off like she was a kid asking for extra allowance. But she hadn't let it go. She'd kept digging, and now she was dead. I thought about that crash again, the police report I'd barely skimmed because I'd been too broken to question it. Faulty brakes, they'd said, but Emily was meticulous. She'd had her car serviced every 6 months like clockwork. What if it wasn't an accident? What if David had? I stopped myself, pressing my hands to my face. It was too much, too fast. But the pieces were falling into place, ugly and jagged. He'd waited until she was gone to drop the divorce on me, to take everything she'd built. Had he been planning this all along? Was her death part of it? I looked at the USB, that tiny black thing holding secrets that could ruin him. Or worse. David thought he'd won, thought he could walk away clean, but I had this now, and he didn't know it. Upstairs, the guest room door creaked open, and I yanked the USB out, shoving it into my pocket with the note. My heart raced as his footsteps thudded down the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway, suitcase in hand, already dressed for his getaway. "I'm leaving," he said, not even looking at me. 2 weeks, Laura. Be out by then." I nodded, keeping my eyes down, playing the part of the broken wife he expected. He didn't see the fire starting to burn inside me, the questions clawing at my throat. He walked out, the front door slamming behind him, and I sat there in the dark, clutching Emily's truth. Whatever he'd done, I was going to find out, and he was going to pay. David's car peeled out of the driveway, tires crunching on the gravel, and I stood there in the kitchen, the USB burning a hole in my pocket. The house was mine for 2 weeks. Emily's house, the one he thought he'd take from me, but I wasn't about to sit around waiting for him to come back and kick me out, not after what I'd found. Emily's voice kept echoing in my head, scared but determined, telling me something was wrong with her dad, my husband, the man I'd trusted for 30 years. I couldn't let this go, not when her death was starting to feel like more than a random tragedy. I needed help, someone who'd believe me, someone who could make sense of this mess. My brother, Tom, was the first person who came to mind. He was 62, a retired cop with a gruff voice and a knack for seeing through bullshit. We'd always been close, even after he moved an hour away to a little cabin by the lake. I grabbed my phone, hands still shaky from the night before, and dialed him. It was barely 7 in the morning, but he picked up on the second ring. "Laura, you okay?" His voice was rough, like he'd just woken up, but I could hear the worry in it. "No," I said, and the word broke something loose inside me. "Tom, I need you here. Something's wrong, really wrong, with David." I spilled it all, the divorce papers at Emily's funeral, the USB, the money he'd siphoned from her company, the Bahamas house. I even told him about that audio, how David had laughed off Emily's questions like she didn't matter. Tom didn't interrupt, just let me talk until I ran out of steam. When I finished, there was a long pause. And then he said, "Pack a bag. I'm coming to get you. We're figuring this out together." He showed up 3 hours later, his old pickup rumbling into the driveway. Tom looked like he always did, broad shoulders, gray hair cropped short, wearing a flannel shirt that's seen better days. He hugged me tight, the kind of hug that makes you feel like you're not alone, and I almost lost it right there. "You look like hell," he said, pulling back to study my face. "When's the last time you slept?" I shrugged, too tired to answer, and he nodded like he got it. "All right, show me what you found." We sat at Emily's desk, the laptop open between us. Tom's jaw tightened as he scrolled through the bank statements, his cop instincts kicking in. "This isn't pocket change," he muttered. "Hundreds of thousands? Moved out over 2 years? That's deliberate, Laura. He's been planning something big." When we played the audio, his eyes narrowed at David's voice. "He's too calm here," Tom said, like he knew she couldn't stop him. "Icehole's got ice in his veins." "What about her crash?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "She told me she wanted to talk about him, and then she's gone." "Tom, what if it wasn't an accident?" He leaned back, rubbing his chin the way he always did when he was thinking hard. "Possible," he said finally. "Emily was smart. She'd have confronted him again after that recording. If he thought she was on to him—" He didn't finish, but he didn't have to. The idea hung there, heavy and sickening. Tom wouldn't let it sit, though. "We need more than this," he said, tapping the USB. "Financial stuff's damning, but it's not proof he hurt her. I know someone, a private investigator I worked with back in the day, Rachel Bennett. She's sharp, discreet, and doesn't mess around. You good with me calling her?" I nodded, desperate for any lifeline. He stepped outside to make the call, and I sat there, staring at Emily's sketches, wondering how my life had turned into this nightmare. Rachel showed up that afternoon, a wiry woman in her 40s with short brown hair and a no-nonsense vibe. She carried a leather satchel slung over her shoulder and shook my hand like we were sealing a deal. "Tom filled me in," she said, setting up her laptop on the kitchen table. "Let's see what we've got." I handed her the USB and she dug in, her fingers flying over the keys. After an hour, she leaned back and whistled low. "Your husband's been busy," she said. "Switzerland's just the start. He's got meetings logged with a woman named Carla Rivera, his old assistant from the construction firm." Lunch dates, coffee runs, even a weekend trip to Miami last year. Looks cozy. Carla? I frowned, trying to place her. She quit 5 years ago, said she was moving out of state. Rachel smirked. Yeah, well, she didn't go far. I've got photos, grainy, but it's her. And, here's the kicker, Emily's company paid for some of those trips, buried as consulting fees. David's been funding his side gig with your daughter's money. My stomach turned. Carla had been around when Emily was in college, quiet, pretty, always lingering near David at company pick. Had he been planning this back then? Rachel wasn't done. I pulled some strings and got the crash photos from Highway 12, she said, sliding a folder across the table. I opened it, and there was Emily's car, crumpled against a guardrail, glass everywhere. My breath hitched, but Rachel pointed to a close-up of the undercarriage. See this? Brake lines severed, clean cut, not frayed. That's not wear and tear, Laura. Someone tampered with it. Tom swore under his breath, and I felt the room tilt. You're saying someone killed her, I said, barely getting the words out. Looks that way, Rachel replied, her voice steady. Could have been David, could have been someone he paid. I'd bet my license he's involved, though. Too much lines up. Tom paced the room, fists clenched. Bastard, he growled. If he did this, Laura, he's not walking away, not from my niece. I nodded, but my mind was racing. Emily's crash wasn't random. Someone had cut her brakes, and David had the most to gain. Her company, her house, his freedom from me. It all fit. I remembered something else then, something buried in the chaos of the last few days. Emily's nightstand drawer. I'd seen it when I was packing her clothes for donation, but hadn't touched it. Wait here, I told them, rushing upstairs. The drawer stuck a little, but I yanked it open and found a small notebook, leather-bound, her initials stamped on the cover. I flipped to the last page, dated 2 days before the crash, and my heart stopped. Dad lost it when I asked about the Swiss account today, she'd written. Said I was in his way and he'd handle it. His hands were shaking, angry, not nervous. I'm scared, Mom. I need to tell you everything. I brought it back to Tom and Rachel, my hands trembling as I read it aloud. Tom's face darkened, and Rachel nodded like it confirmed something she already suspected. That's motive, she said. He knew she was on to him and he panicked. Tom put a hand on my shoulder. We've got enough to nail him on the money, he said, but if we're taking him down for Emily, we need more. Something he can't wiggle out of. I want to face him, I said, surprising myself with how steady my voice sounded. When he gets back, I want him to look me in the eye and explain this. Tom frowned. Too risky, Laura. He's dangerous. But I shook my head. He thinks I'm weak, Tom. He's counting on it. Let him come home. I'll be ready. Rachel grinned, a glint in her eye. I like it. We'll wire the place. Catch him slipping. He won't see it coming. For the first time since Emily's funeral, I felt something besides grief. Anger, hot and fierce, driving me forward. David thought he'd buried his secrets with her. He had no idea what I was about to do. The 2 weeks crawled by, every day heavier than the last. Tom stayed with me, sleeping on Emily's couch, his old police revolver tucked under the cushion just in case. Rachel worked fast, too fast almost, setting up tiny microphones around the house, hidden in the lamp by the couch, behind a picture frame in the living room. State of the art, she'd said, tapping one with her fingernail. He'll never know. She and Tom drilled me on what to say when David got back. Keep him talking, let him think he'd won. Don't push too hard. I practiced in front of the bathroom mirror. trying to look broken, defeated, the way he'd always seen me. It wasn't hard. I still felt half dead most of the time, but underneath that, something else was growing. Anger, yes, but also a kind of clarity I hadn't had in years. Emily's notebook sat on my nightstand, her last words, "I'm scared, Mom," fueling me every time I wavered. She trusted me to fix this, even if she didn't know it then. And David? He thought he could waltz back in, tanned and smug, and take everything she'd built. He thought I'd just roll over like I always had. Not this time. Rachel got a tip from a contact at the airport. David's flight landed a day early. He hadn't bothered to tell me, probably hoping to catch me off guard, still packing my bags like some kicked-out tenant. Tom got the call at dawn, his voice low as he relayed it. "He's on his way, Laura, hour tops." My stomach flipped, but I nodded, pulling on a cardigan, soft gray, the kind of thing David would expect me to wear, nothing threatening. Rachel tested the mics one last time, then slipped out with Tom to a van parked 2 streets over, where they'd listen with a couple of cops she'd looped in. "You've got this," she said before she left, squeezing my arm. "Make him talk." I sat on the couch, hands folded in my lap, the little recorder pen Rachel had given me tucked into my pocket. My heart hammered so loud I was sure it'd give me away, but I kept my breathing steady, picturing Emily's face, her bright smile, the way she'd light up talking about her designs. The clock ticked past 8, and then I heard it, the crunch of tires on gravel, the car door slamming shut. He was here. The front door swung open and David stepped inside, suitcase in one hand, a leather jacket slung over his shoulder. He looked different, younger somehow, with a tan that made his gray hair stand out sharp against his skin. The Bahamas had been good to him, apparently. He spotted me on the couch and gave a curt nod, like I was a housekeeper he'd forgotten to fire. "Laura," he said, setting the suitcase down, "you're still here. Thought you'd be gone by now." "I needed time," I said, keeping my voice small, my eyes on the floor. "It's a lot to figure out." He snorted, moving into the living room, his boots leaving faint dirt marks on Emily's hardwood. He ran a hand over the back of her armchair, like he was claiming it already. "Yeah, well, time's up," he said. "I've got a buyer lined up for the house next week. Company's mine, too. Papers are signed. You'll get a check from the divorce settlement. Don't say I didn't take care of you." I swallowed hard, letting a little tremor slip into my voice. "Take care of me? David, you left me at our daughter's funeral. After 30 years, why now?" He sighed like I was a kid asking a dumb question and poured himself a glass of bourbon from Emily's bar cart. "Look, Laura, there's no good time for this stuff," he said, swirling the drink. "Emily's death just sped things up. I've been stuck too long. 30 years playing the good husband, the good dad. I'm done." "Speed things up," I echoed, lifting my eyes to meet his. He leaned against the counter, casual, like we were chatting about the weather. "What do you mean by that?" He took a sip, smirking a little. "Let's just say I've had plans for a while. Options. You wouldn't get it. You never did. Always happy to stay home, let me handle the real work." His words stung, but I kept my face soft, wounded, the way he'd want it. "Options," I said quietly. "Like Carla?" His hand froze halfway to his mouth, the glass hovering there. For a split second, something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, maybe, or irritation, but he covered it fast, setting the drink down with a deliberate clink. "You've been snooping," he said, his tone still light but edged with something harder. "Carla's old news, Laura. She's just a friend helping me sort some things out." "Sort things out?" I repeated, letting my voice waver. Like moving money to Switzerland? Buying that house in the Bahamas? His jaw tightened just enough for me to notice, and he straightened up, crossing his arms. What are you getting at? You don't know what you're talking about. I reached into my pocket, slow and careful, and pulled out Emily's notebook, holding it up so he could see her handwriting on the cover. Emily did, I said. She found out, David. She wrote it all down, the accounts, the transfers. She asked you about it, didn't she? He laughed, but it was forced, brittle. Emily was paranoid, he said, stepping closer, always poking into things she didn't understand. I told her it was business, nothing shady. She didn't need to worry. I flipped the notebook open to that last page, my hands steady now. She wrote you got mad when she asked about Switzerland, I said. Said she was in your way. What did you mean by that, David? His smile faded, and he took another step toward me, his shadow falling across the couch. You're twisting things, he said, voice low. Grief's messing with your head. What about her car? I pressed, watching his face close. The brakes? Someone cut them. It wasn't an accident. He froze, just for a heartbeat, then shook his head like I'd lost it. That's insane, Laura. You think I'd hurt my own kid? I'm grieving too, you know. But there was no grief in him, not in his steady hands, not in the way he stood there, untouched by the weight of her death. I stood up, slow, keeping my distance. She was on to you, I said. She was going to tell me, and you couldn't let that happen. His eyes narrowed, and he moved faster than I expected, closing the gap between us. You've got no proof, he snapped, his voice rising. Nothing but some scribbles and wild ideas. You're pathetic, Laura, always were. I slipped my hand back into my pocket, fingers brushing the recorder pen, and clicked it on. Then why move the money right after she died? I asked, louder now. We'll meet Carla all those times? Emily had records, David, conversations, receipts. She knew you were stealing from her. He lunged for the notebook, but I yanked it back, stumbling against the couch. Give me that, he snarled, his calm shattering. You've got no idea what you're messing with. I held it out of reach, my heart pounding. Did you kill her, David? Did you cut her brakes because she found out? He stopped, breathing hard, and then a slow, ugly smile spread across his face. She was a problem, he said, his voice dropping to a hiss, always asking questions, sticking her nose where it didn't belong. But it's handled now, isn't it? And you're nothing without me. Did you kill her? I shouted, stepping back as he advanced. He laughed again, colder this time. Prove it, Laura, you've got nothing. I pulled the recorder pen from my pocket, holding it up so he could see the tiny red light blinking. I've got this, I said, and his face went slack, eyes widening. You're done, David. He lunged again, grabbing my wrist hard enough to bruise, and we grappled for it, the pen slipping from my fingers and skittering across the floor. You stupid, he started, shoving me back, and I hit the coffee table, pain shooting up my side. Before he could finish, the front door burst open and Tom stormed in, Rachel and 2 cops right behind him. David Hensley, you're under arrest, one of the officers barked, gun drawn. David spun around, the pen still clutched in his fist, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. She set me up, he yelled, pointing at me as the cuffs clicked around his wrists. She's lying. This is all her. Tom helped me up, his grip steady, while Rachel scooped up the recorder. We heard everything, she said, her voice cutting through his protests. You're cooked, pal. The cops hauled him out, his shouts fading as they shoved him into the squad car. I stood there, leaning on Tom, watching the man I'd loved for 3 decades get dragged away. He'd admitted it, not straight out, but enough. Emily was a problem, and he'd handled it. My knees buckled, but Tom held me up. "You did it, Laura," he said, his voice rough with pride. "For Emily." I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. But I wasn't crying for David. I was crying for her, for the truth I'd finally clawed out of him. He thought he'd won, but he didn't know what I'd done days earlier, what I'd set in motion. And this was just the start. The weeks after David's arrest blurred into a storm of chaos and quiet moments I didn't know how to fill. He was locked up, denied bail after the judge heard the recording, his voice cold and venomous, calling Emily a problem he'd handled. The cops had the financial records too, stacks of them showing how he'd bled her company dry, and the forensic team confirmed the brake line on her car had been sliced clean through. Murder, fraud, theft, he was facing it all, and the headlines screamed his name across every local paper. I didn't read them. I didn't need to see his face to know he'd lost. Tom stayed close, crashing at Emily's place most nights, keeping me company while the legal mess sorted itself out. Rachel popped in too, updating me on the case, her sharp eyes softening every time she saw me staring at Emily's sketches on the fridge. "He's going down hard," she told me one afternoon, sipping coffee at the kitchen table. "Life without parole, minimum. You nailed him, Laura." I nodded, but it didn't feel like a win. Not yet. Emily was still gone, and the house echoed with her absence. David's betrayal had gutted me, but I'd survived it. I just didn't know what came next. Then, a week after the arrest, Rachel called me late, her voice tight. "Laura, you need to come to my office, now. There's something you don't know." I grabbed my coat, heart pounding, and Tom drove me across town, his truck rattling over potholes while I chewed my lip raw. "What's she got?" he asked, glancing at me. "No idea," I said, but my gut twisted with the same dread I'd felt when I found Emily's USB. Whatever it wasn't over. Rachel's office was a cramped space above a deli, smelling faintly of pastrami and coffee grounds. She was waiting, a folder spread out on her desk, her face grim. "Sit down," she said, pushing a chair toward me. Tom hovered by the door, arms crossed, while I sank into the seat, bracing myself. "We thought David was the end game," she started, tapping the folder. "He's not. He had help. Someone who did the dirty work." I frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean?" "Who?" She slid a photo across the desk, a grainy shot from a gas station security camera, time-stamped the night before Emily's crash. A woman stood by a car, Emily's car, crouched near the wheel well, a tool in her hand. My breath caught. "That's Carla," I said, recognizing her sleek dark hair, the way she held herself like she owned every room she walked into. Rachel nodded. "Carla Rivera, David's friend. Turns out she's more than that. She's the one who cut the brakes." The room spun for a second, and I gripped the chair arms to steady myself. "Carla killed Emily?" I whispered, the words tasting bitter. Rachel's jaw tightened. "Looks like it." I dug deeper after the arrest. Phone records, bank transfers. David wired her 10 grand 2 days before the crash, labeled it consulting, and here's the kicker. She's gone. Flew to the Bahamas 3 days ago, right after David got picked up. She's sitting on a chunk of that Swiss money, probably thinks she's untouchable. Tom swore, loud and sharp, pacing the tiny office. "She's in on it," he growled, "the whole damn time." I stared at the photo, my mind racing back. Carla had known Emily. Hell, they'd gone to college together, overlapped a couple years before Carla dropped out. I remembered her at Emily's graduation party, sulking in a corner while Emily beamed with her diploma. She'd always had this edge, this quiet resentment I'd chalked up to youth, and then she'd worked for David, trailing him like a shadow until she quit. Had she hated Emily that much? Enough to kill her for him? "There's more," Rachel said, pulling me back. She flipped open the folder, revealing a handwritten note photocopied from Carla's apartment, found by a cop friend before she skipped town. "David E's asking too many questions. I'll handle it if you make it worth my while. C." My hands shook as I read it, the casual way she'd signed off on my daughter's life. "She planned it with him," I said, voice breaking. "She's the one who—" I couldn't finish, the weight of it crashing down. Rachel nodded, her eyes steady on mine. David gave the order, but Carla pulled the trigger, or the pliers in this case. She's got blood on her hands, Laura, and she's laughing about it somewhere on a beach right now. Tom slammed a fist against the wall, denting the plaster. "We can get her," he said. "Extradition, something." But Rachel shook her head. "Not easy. Bahamas doesn't play nice with us unless the case is airtight and she's covered her tracks. For now, she's out of reach." I sat there, numb, the photo of Carla burning into my brain. David was a monster, but I'd known him, lived with him, loved him once. Carla was different, a ghost from Emily's past turned executioner. She'd smiled at my daughter's wedding, toasted her success, all while plotting this with the man I'd called my husband. The twist of it, the sheer, sickening unfairness, hit me harder than anything else. I'd thought catching David was justice, but it wasn't. Not fully, not while she walked free. Tom drove me home, silent the whole way, and I spent that night staring at the ceiling, Carla's face haunting me. But something shifted as the hours ticked by. I couldn't get her, not yet, but I could damn well make sure Emily's legacy didn't die with her. David's trial came 3 months later, and I didn't go. I let Tom and Rachel handle it, texting me when the gavel fell. Guilty, life without parole. The company assets were unfrozen, split between me and a trust Emily had set up for a local art school. I had money now, more than I'd ever expected at 58. But it wasn't about that. I started small, using some of it to fund a program for women like me, ones blindsided by betrayal, left to pick up the pieces. I called it Emily's Light, and it grew fast, offering counseling, job training, a lifeline. People showed up, women with stories that mirrored mine and some that didn't. And I found myself talking, sharing, building something real. But that wasn't all. I'd always loved gardens, the way plants could turn a blank space into something alive. David had laughed it off years ago, said it was a waste of time, so I'd let it go. Not anymore. I enrolled at the community college landscape design classes twice a week. At 58, I was the oldest in the room, surrounded by kids half my age, but they didn't care. My first project, a garden layout for a women's shelter, got me an A and a quiet kind of pride I hadn't felt in decades. One night I had Tom and Rachel over to my new place, a little apartment I'd bought with clean money, no trace of David in it. We sat around the table, takeout boxes piled up, and I raised a glass. "To Emily," I said, my voice steady. "She kept me going, even when I didn't know it." "To you, Laura," Tom added, his gruff smile breaking through. "You fought back and won." Rachel clinked her glass, grinning. "Damn right. Here's to sticking it to the bastards." We laughed, and it felt good, real, like a weight lifting. Later I stepped onto the balcony, the city lights stretching out below, a cool breeze brushing my face. Carla was still out there, sure, sipping cocktails on stolen cash, but she didn't own me. Neither did David. I'd lost my daughter, my marriage, everything I'd thought defined me. But I'd found something else. Myself. The next morning, I met with the Emily's Light Board, agreeing to speak at their first big fundraiser. My story, not as David's wife or Emily's mom, but as Laura Hensley, a woman who'd stared down betrayal and built something better from the ashes. At 58, I wasn't done. I was just starting, and somewhere I hoped Emily could see it.